what the solar grid is all about. Maybe some of you have read excerpts, maybe some of you have read the first 5 issues. Maybe you're here because you're a fan of Ganzeer and Saladin, but that music gives you a good precursor for what to expect. This is a dystopian, but is it really? Graphic series. There is sci-fi in it, but is it really? And there is a reckoning with the disastrous effect of climate change and capitalism. So does that make it futuristic or does that make it now? I think all of this will come up today. I want to introduce myself. My name is Meher. My pronouns are she, her, whatever's respectful. I am a worker at Radix Media, and we are the publishers behind the Solar Grid. If you'd like to see any information about us, please visit our website. It's www.radixmedia.org. I'm just sharing that in the chat. Sorry. I'm gonna put it in the chat. Firstly, can I just start off by saying I really appreciate all of you guys for joining us. I know there is Zoom fatigue. I know it's been a year and a half of having to be on our laptops, and we all hate it. And the season's great. The weather is nice. You want to be outside. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join us and be indoors or wherever you are. I also want to quickly describe myself for accessibility purposes. I am an Indian woman with black hair. I'm wearing a white top, and behind me is, your regular beige rented apartment walls. That's the best way I can describe it. So we're here to celebrate the release of issue 5 of the Solar Grid, as well as the world of the Solar Grid that author and illustrator Ganzeer has created. Let me give you a little backstory of how we stumbled upon the Solar Grid. Radix Media as publishers, we've known Ganzeer for a while. We've published his earlier project with Elliot Kola, who is here, a beautiful illustrated narrative prose poem called We're All Things, which is also available on the Radix Media store. So please check it out. And so when Ganzeer brought us this project, this maddening, expansive, ridiculous project that he'd been working on for the last 5 years, and he said, hey, this is anti-capitalist, this confronts climate change, this confronts the sort of billionaire politician nexus, we were like, yeah, sign us up. Last year, we were able to run a Kickstarter project to fund 3 graphic narratives. One was The Solar Grid by Ganzeer. The other is Mortals by John Dermot Woods and Matt L., which will be published in March 2022. And the other project is a wonderful coloring book called Fanning the Flames by illustrator Molly Crabapple, which will be out in October. And so the way we are releasing the Solar Grid is it spans 10 issues. The first 5 issues have been released this year. The 5th issue came out today. And the remaining 5 will be releasing next year from April to August. So we're very sorry for leaving you on a cliffhanger, which if you're going to read the Solar Grid, you will realize that issue 5 ends on a terrifying cliffhanger, and you'll have to hold it in for the next 5-6 months. But I promise you the wait will be worth it. You can read more about what the Solar Grid is about, and you can also purchase previous issues. You can also subscribe to all 10 issues. When you subscribe to it, as each issue is released, we will send it over to your home. Just for today, we have a special offer. If you subscribe to all 10 issues of the Solar Grid, you also get a Radix Media tote bag. It's a very cute tote bag. Tote bags are great. You can hold a lot of things in it. I don't have to sell you on it. You guys are here. You love tote bags. That's why you're here. And so, yeah, you get a Radix Media tote bag. So feel free to subscribe to all 10 issues of the Solar Grid. So today, we have Ganzeer and the wonderful Saladin Ahmed joining us. They're going to be in conversation. They're going to talk about graphic novels. They're going to talk about the Solar Grid. They're also going to talk about what it means to be political when we are creating art, right? And I'm going to introduce our artists today very quickly. About Ganzeer. Ganzeer, described as a chameleon in the New York Times, Ganzeer operates seamlessly between art, design, and storytelling, creating what he has coined concept pop. His art is regularly exhibited in museums and galleries around the world, and he is a frequent speaker at colleges and universities. His sci-fi graphic novel, The Solar Grid, published in serialized form by Radix Media, has earned him a Global Thinker Award from Foreign Policy. You can find more information about him at ganzeer.com. I'm also sharing the bio in the chat so you can take a quick look at it. I want to introduce our other speaker for today evening, Saladin Ahmed. Here you go. Saladin Ahmed was born in Detroit. His fiction has been anthologized by George R.R. Martin, performed by the great LeVar Burton, and cited in the Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook. His novel, Throne of the Crescent Moon, praised by NPR as Lord of the Rings meets the Arab Spring, was nominated for the Hugo, Nebula, and British Fantasy Awards, and won the Locus Award for Best First Novel. Black Bolt, a collaboration with Christian Ward that tackled incarceration and cosmic power in the Marvel Universe, won the Eisner Award for Best New Series. Abbott, a collaboration with Sami Kivelä about journalism and horror, was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. Saladin is currently working on Miles Morales' Spider-Man for Marvel, Batman Unburied for DC, and Dragon, a creator-owned collaboration with Dave Acosta about Dracula and the Ottoman Empire. Welcome, Saladin. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to open this session up by passing the mic to Ganzeer, who's going to share a little excerpt from The Solar Grid. Take it away, Ganzeer.
Thank you, Meher, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone who made time to attend another, another Zoom type thing. As Meher said, where I'm sure we're all sick of doing this sort of thing. And definitely, thanks to Saladin for joining and being willing to partake in this discussion and do it. We only know each other through the social media verse, so we don't really know each other. So it's really cool of him to take the time out to do this. Very much appreciate it for sure. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the solar grid. I won't get too much into the weeds because I think that the actual discussion with Saladin would probably be far more interesting than kind of like a PowerPoint presentation of the solar grid. And excuse baby screaming noise in the background. Don't let that alarm you. It's totally natural. Let me go ahead and share this thing. Screen share. Okay, and then okay, so the solar grid. The solar grid is a serialized graphic novel that I have been working on for a number of years now. Let's not get into that. And the story takes place after the Earth has suffered from a global flood, which has either submerged or partially submerged most cities on the planet. So not the far, far future. And basically what that does is it prompts kind of an acceleration of two things. One is an exodus to Mars. And two is the construction of something called the solar grid. I'll get to what the solar grid is in a minute. So talking about an exodus to Mars, what that does is, of course, it kind of, you can imagine if people are pushed to move from Earth to Mars, obviously not everyone on the planet will be able to make that move to Mars. And so, it raises questions of who gets to go and who gets left behind, which gets into, race, nationality, class, gender, so on and so forth. I don't think I explicitly get into the graphic novel really, but maybe it's hinted at. We'll talk about that over the course of the discussion, I guess. But the other thing, which is the construction of the solar grid, which is basically a vast network of satellites, these very colossal satellites that orbit the planet. and keep it basked in eternal daylight, which you see on the right-hand side of the image here. And the way it works is basically the satellites, they absorb the power, the rays of the sun in outer space, and then they beam that light onto Earth in the dead of night. And what that does, the reason it's constructed is twofold. One is to essentially overheat the planet and get that get all the flooded cities, all the water to essentially evaporate. So the cities are no longer flooded. And the other thing is to power solar powered factories on Earth. And that way the factories get to run 24/7. They don't have to stop and produce the goods that are necessary for life on Mars. And what Mars does is send the waste back to Earth. So Mars doesn't have to deal with its own waste issues. And so at this point in the future, the planet is no longer flooded, and it has essentially been reduced to a large landfill. And in this setting, we have two orphans on Earth, Mehdith and Kameen, who rummage through the waste, searching for items, valuable items they could sell or live off. And they come upon an item that gets them, and basically starts a chain reaction that will eventually, and Mehdith hates when I do the giveaway, but that leads to the destruction of the solar grid, basically. And that's kind of the gist of the story. And I happily kind of give away the ending because it's kind of not really about the ending. It's about like how we get there in a sense, So the story is very, very non-linear. Here you see at the bottom, in the bottom panel, Mehdith and Kameen kind of outfitted in what they call solar suits, which is what people need to wear to kind of during solar grid hours to protect them from kind of the harmful rays. And what I do in the solar grid, because I explore kind of the story in a very non-linear way and jump around in back and forth in time a lot. And I also use that as an excuse to kind of explore various kind of styles, illustration styles, and kind of mark making techniques. You'll see here, this is an example of kind of the two main styles that I employ in the main timeline, which is 949 after the flood, I believe it was, which is the timeline where Mehdith and Kameen are rummaging through the waste on Earth. And so, like in one example on the left-hand side of the page, you see basically the kind of use of shadows in black and white, which is kind of the standard approach of that timeline. But then when the solar grid is activated, as you see on the right-hand side, that's where I kind of employ this really just really kind of narrow, thin kind of line art, all kind of, it's all kind of the same weight, as a way to kind of evoke a sense of the world kind of being flooded with light, which is kind of not something we actually experience ever in real life, right? Even if you're facing really bright light, there will be like a shadow thrown somewhere behind you from on some angle, at some angle, but never do we ever experience like light from all angles to the point where there is no shadow whatsoever. So there was no way to kind of depict that realistically. So you had to kind of come up with a graphic solution to kind of just get the sense of it, I guess you might say. Other styles employed throughout the text, or throughout the the work is you see like this on the left hand side there, kind of like going employing some grayscale, and for some scenes that take place a little bit in the past, and then which is very different, say for example, from the scenes I use when the earth is very, very flooded, which was only takes place very recently after the global flood. And on the right hand side you see that kind of style employed with like lots of ink wash and so many values, almost like make it feel very moldy and wet and humid, here are a couple of other styles I employ also throughout the graphic novel. So on the left-hand side this is kind of a flashback scene. So I felt like a very whimsical line where the lines aren't like really kind of accurate, and it's all kind of done with a brush, very flowy like. Uh-oh. Fire. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Okay, false alarm. Sorry about that. So on the right hand side, this is another scene where that takes place. I believe this is in going to be in issue 6, so the coming chapter that will be released next year. And this scene takes place in Japan, in Tokyo, Japan. And so I wanted to kind of work some manga influences in there. But, sometimes the stereotypical manga thing is like, okay, I'm just going to draw everyone with like big eyes or something, which is not really what I wanted to do. I just kind of made, I guess you might say, went for more of the essence, what I felt was the essence of manga. So just animated body language and facial expressions, some layout and storytelling decisions. So, vertical gutters are thinner than the horizontal gutters, which is quite common in a lot of manga. The pacing, so there's kind of this jump cut scene to like the door kind of swinging. So you kind of in manga sometimes you see a lot of the camera being taken off of like the main character, and it just points at an action that evokes what's happening instead. So things like that, the exit door there, loud sound effects, like even if it's like a quiet sound effect in manga, you find it being kind of expressed very loudly, and just kind of like character mannerisms and things like that. But we are here today to talk about, we're here to celebrate the release of issue number 5 of the Solar Grid. So perhaps we'll get into that a bit more specifically, but also in general, just chat with Saladin about all things, graphic narrative and all the awesome things we can do with words and pictures. Well, I guess we'll move to that.
Thank you so much, Ganzeer. I'm going to now invite Saladin Ahmed to take over this conversation. It's so fascinating to see you talk about the entire book. I also want to give a quick note to the audience that there's going to be Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, hold on to them and you will be able to drop them in the chat. You can keep dropping them in the chat as Ganzeer and Saladin are talking in the interest of time. And I'm happy to read them on your behalf, or you can read your own question if you feel up for it. Saladin, I'm going to now invite you to take it over.
Yeah, thank you so much. I apologize for disappearing there for a second. Wow. That was super interesting because you anticipated a lot. I had a lot of style questions, but I'm gonna go like 10,000 feet first and just say, yeah, it's weird. Ganzeer and I only know each other from the internet, from Twitter and such. And for me, admiring his work, you know, his work generally, but then especially when the solar grid was put in front of me, I work a lot in very constrained story worlds and very mediated industries in a very self-conscious way. To me, there's all sorts of reasons for people who care about things like workers' rights, who care about things like environmental destruction, who care about things like colonialism and its aftermath or continuing math. All of the sort of concerns that come up in the solar grid, I think we need to be talking about those in all the avenues we have of public discourse and public storytelling. And I kind of hoe my row in a world where you have to be very cautious, both in the message and the way you get it out there, and a bit conservative formally. Both mainstream superhero comics and the little dabbling in Hollywood that I've done, you know, that's the interplay, is pushing against that at the same time, always kind of being aware that your ability to reach folks on a certain scale is dependent on being sly about it. And the solar grid is it's brilliant, but it's not. It doesn't need to be sly in that way. And it's so. It was just such a refreshing read, both in the. It's funny because you sort of said, I don't know if I tackle this stuff explicitly, and you know, I questions like race, colonialism, nationality. I don't know that you do it in. It never feels heavy-handed, but it's all there, and it's all there in ways, you know, I wish our mainstream culture had more room for, but is afraid of for very, you know, very clear reasons. So it's been a joy to read, and so to get to talk, you know, it is true. I have Zoom fatigue as much as anyone, and there are very few things where I will get on this damn thing again, and and this was an occasion where I really felt like I had to. So so it's awesome to talk to you.
Man, I can't like just like let you carry on without saying like thank you. I'm like so appreciative that you are taking the time out. Like honestly, like you have no idea, and also just like for your kind words, because like I know that the solar grid, like I'm not oblivious to the solar grid's weirdness, and I know that it's one of those things that either the reader will really like it, which I think based on what you're saying, it sounds like that's the case, or really hate it because it's so weird. Like there's no one's gonna have in like sort of washy in between feelings about it. Like I don't, you know, so I'm glad it's managed to speak to you on the good side. Yeah.
I don't, it does not elicit wishy-washy feelings. It elicits powerful feelings, and it's so there's a bunch of angles that we could talk about it from, and I'm going to keep an eye on the time here. I know we want to keep some room for Q&A and stuff, but I think so. The first thing that is interesting to me is actually I was going to start with something different, but you started pretty early by spoiling the ending, and you talk about how you sometimes get scolded for that, and I think you know, it's interesting. I think folks who are deeply immersed in process and control so many angles of process, you're like, oh, it's the getting there. It's not the, but coming from this world of people are like, you get in fucking trouble if you spoil what's going to happen to Spider-Man next month, right? It's interesting because one of the things I've really been enjoying I've been reading in chapters, actually. I didn't, and I think there's a seriality there. That's, I mean, I know this will be eventually collected as a graphic novel and stuff, but I think the distinct chapters, the way you do cliffhangers is, you guys sort of apologized for leaving readers on a cliffhanger, and okay, maybe a few months is a while to wait, but I think, yeah, I think that's a strength. I think that's a feature, not a bug in this, and so maybe that's maybe more of a comment than than a question here. Is I think that this is really, it's cool stuff. Like for instance, the splash page that ends the first issue. And it's really sad, you guys, but it's also, it's really powerful. And yeah, so I think it's just to say that there's a weirdness absolutely there, and I love the weirdness. I love the stylistic bouncing back and forth. I want to talk about that in a minute, but I think there are these little hallmarks that feel like this is a comic book, this is not like, I know what this is in a good way, and then I don't know what it is in a good way too. So yeah, it's anyone who's sort of watching this and just sort of like, hey, what is this thing? You should go buy it now. I want to ask you, I guess, a little bit about influences, which is kind of a boring question usually, I know, but I want to start. Most of the stuff I'm going to share is going to be from the first issue, just because I do believe a little bit in spoilers and such, and so I'm not going to like share a lot of stuff that happens later on. But so okay, now I'm going to do my old man tech here and make sure. Let's see. There we go. So this is from some of the very first panels of the book, and it's super interesting to me because we start out with a big zoomed out view of like the Earth, and we see some stars and stuff, and then we're pretty immediately in this trash heap. And looking at this heap, I thought of Jack Kirby, actually, weirdly. I thought of I thought of the cosmic. And even though this is literal trash we're looking at, there's a lot of places, this is just sort of one example, I think. There's a lot of places in this book where the style, and you're going to have to forgive me because I'm a writer who's pretty recently come to the comic form, and I'm pretty ignorant in talking about visual art. So it was fascinating talking about, hearing you talk about process. And I guess the heavier line there, that's the kind of main timeline. Where does that come from? I mean, like, who does that come from? Where, when you started looking at this and you think about your different styles, like, is there shorthand for yourself from other artists, from periods? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because like I mean, I don't know, can I do this? This is, if I show you the pile that's only sitting of comics and books that's only on the shelf, which is a small shelf. It's intentionally a small shelf so I could limit the books that are like in front of me in my workspace. I have the rest of the stuff downstairs in the garage because there's too much of it. But if I show you, let's see, this shelf right here, I don't know, can you guys see it? Does this angle work? Because I can't see what you see from if I'm holding my laptop like this.
We see it. We can't tell it apart, but we see it.
Okay, so we have the 6 Voyages of Lone Sloan by Philip Bouillet, and we have a bunch of storyteller magazines by Barry Windsor Smith. I love these so much. Milligan and McCarthy, New Gods, Jack Kirby, you pointed them out. Paul Pope, 100%. Sin City, Frank Miller, also Frank Miller here, Batman Noir. So the Dark Knight Returns, but the black and white edition. And that's definitely a big clue for you because I am a slut for black and white comics way more than color comics. Like sometimes I'll buy a color comic if that's the only way I could get it, and it's like really good. But I wish there were more comics in America produced in black and white, to be honest. This is amazing, by the way, Lando Gardens of Glass breakdown press, which like this, if you want a direct inspiration, quite honestly, like this, his single line kind of style was definitely, I just stole for those scenes with the washed out kind of with the very bright solar grid scenes, you know. Like generally I tend to lean more towards like throwing shadows a lot, so the tendency to like kind of like really resist that and do this like no shadow at all and all like single weight lines was did not come naturally, let's say that. And so it's a very, like, my influences are very diverse, you know. I really like to and these are just the comics, like I'll also draw from other art forms, you know. This is a weird one I'm reading now, but it's like it's got some brilliant stuff in it. Like, for example, like I'm not naturally drawn towards like this kind of illustration style in comics. But the thing is, when you look at the weird stuff, you'll always find something just interesting and weird that you don't find in the typical mainstream stuff. And so I'm still stuck, like I've been reading, but I'm still stuck on this one thing this dude did, which I think is brilliant. Back in, there's this part where he says, there's this part where he says, I can't find it, obviously. Where, oh yeah, here it is. So this is like, he's telling a story, it's some experience, this alien abduction experience, it's kind of weird. And so he's going through it, and then he saw the alien for the first time, and he felt really afraid. So here is a panel, wait, sorry, this one, right, where he says, the caption read, like you look at it and it's just some abstract, you can't, it's nothing. But the caption reads, what I felt at that moment is best expressed in a more abstract way. By using these simple word image vignettes below, we would later use these extensively during therapy. I often found them to be strangely accurate. And so he goes on and does these abstract things about his feelings, and some of them are quite frightening. So you're like, oh, okay, this guy was afraid, you know what I mean? And you, or whatever it is, however, as a reader, you interpret these weird abstract things that are supposedly evocative of this dude's feelings. You never get that in like, corporate comics. So I don't know, I just like try and like look and find a lot of different things. If you name an artist, I will probably be able to tell you some kind of story I've had encounter with that artist's work, like literally, like the more you can draw from, I feel like the more interesting the work is, which I would argue is like, if you look at, Frank Miller's work at his best, and a lot of comic artists tend to, put him on a pedestal in terms of what he did with comics. Dude kind of was looking at stuff from Argentina, stuff from Japan, stuff from Europe, looking at like so many different influences, and not just like stuck on being like, with all due respect to like Jim Lee, he wasn't like, I'm just gonna like study Jim Lee and I'm gonna like, do that and that's it, and end it there, and which is, I feel, unfortunate with a lot of artists in comics tend to like really focus too much on one or two artists in comics,
No, and that's it's absolutely, there's a closed loop in mainstream American comics of or there can be a closed loop, because, and it's all, I mean, to kind of like bring it back to us talking about this in a political context, it's all tied to the conditions for workers. That's where the steady bread is, that's where the steady paycheck is doing a house style that feels similar to something that's been done for 20 years and is, and unfortunately that sometimes affects the writing, where even the storylines are sort of just sort of endlessly self-referential, and and breaking out of those circles and those cycles is just it's moving uphill when you're trying to just kind of put food on the table at the same time. And so I'm sympathetic to where that static style comes from, but I always, when I talk to younger writers, even I'm always telling them you should be reading poetry, you should be reading history, you should be reading Fanon, for instance, which there are not many comics where the epigraph is from from the Wretched of the Earth. So
but I would say, like, the standout writers of comics, I think it's clear that they were were and are, well versed in things outside of comics as well as the comics themselves, right? Like, so at a certain point, I feel like it's like no one would assume that Alan Moore only read comics. No one would assume that Saladin Ahmed only read comics, you know what I mean? So on and so forth. So it's interesting that exists. That is the tendency with a lot of people, even though they know that the really awesome ones, right, we're looking outside of the medium.
Yeah, I think at the best, and there's still folks, of course, doing that. When you look at independent comics, whether it's web comics or independent comics, monthlies, graphic novelists, for younger readers especially, are really just sort of not worried about what old white guys were doing 20 years ago, and are just kind of making books that speak to people like my daughter and my son. And I think it's like, thank God, thank God that's happening. So I know we got to make room for some questions and stuff. One other thing that I wanted to ask about specifically was, as a kind of real specific question, so forgive the nerdery here, but so one of the things that Ganzeer's book is about change, right? And it's about transformation of an unjust order, but just some sort of questions about what comes, how that happens, what comes after, all that stuff. And that's obviously stuff that you've kind of been dealing with in your work since before this book. It's stuff you dealt with in your own life, right? In terms of dealing with the regime in Egypt. And there's something very early, another like some of the very earliest panels that I want to share with people, if I can get this to work. No, hold on. Sorry. Am I back with you again? I am. And here we go. Okay, so here we have kind of our two young orphans sort of introducing themselves by beating the shit out of each other. And the physicality throughout here is this really interesting to me, whether it's people getting punched in the face, whether it's people kind of waking up in bed, whether it's there's just this interest in bodies. I don't know, maybe I'm projecting this onto you, but I see these bodies rendered in really again very intense ways that feel different than the ways that we're often seeing in comics, where everything's action. And I guess one thing I'm curious about, because this is, even though it's a different kind of story, it is a science fiction story that has some physical stuff in it. And so I'm just curious, what do you think about that, about action, about plot? Like, is that important to you as a storyteller? Because you started out by just being like, here's what happens at the end. in a way that for me would be very difficult to do. And your work seems very suspicious of like kind of physical heroism in a way. And I'm curious where that comes from for you. Is that a weird, too abstract of a question, or does it make sense?
No, it's definitely a topic of, it can start a discussion, which might actually kind of lead me to segue into a question for you. But so I have a very odd relationship with genre, in that, you know, in that I really like genre fiction, but I like it more when it's bent a little and not just like colored by numbers, I guess. Like it has enough of familiarity, but a lot of invention to go with it, and kind of like reasons to use those conventions that are more clever and not just for marketing reasons, if that makes sense. So not to state the obvious again, I mean, I feel like a lot of the times when I end up talking about comics, I find myself just like talking and you know, bringing up Alan Moore. But Alan Moore, you know, is just like an obvious example of someone who uses genre. Like his fiction is all genre, but it's like so different from the rest of genre fiction, right? It's unique because he knows that he's using it to tell a story that has a purpose for being told, you know. And so I guess, and also it's not like I like one genre only, you know, like I find myself like enjoying crime fiction and science fiction, and so in a way, the same way like all these various graphic influences have made their way to the work, I think a lot of various writing influences have done the same, in that like, well, I feel like I'm just like open to the idea of like including all of these genres and letting them mix in a natural way where I don't feel like, okay, the rules of this world is that it has to abide by only these genre conventions and not these other ones. Especially because my view is that although it's very obviously a work of fiction and very imaginative in so many ways, it is, to me, relates to the world we live in, and the world we live in is a you know, genre bending world, right? You know, like right now, you know, a few blocks away from here, you know, there might be a gunshot and there might be a body kind of floating in the bayou, but there's also probably a couple sitting in the park and in love. And so you have that romance happening at the same time. This crime thing is happening at the same time. Elon Musk is plotting to go to Mars, right? I mean, that's the world we live in. So there's no reason why you can't have all these things happen in the same story. In my opinion, I don't know if that answers the question, but to turn it into a question towards you, because you talked about like working in a very constrained circumstances or constrained industries. I'm not sure what you want to how you would describe the setting, but I'm always torn between, on one hand, like on one hand, I sort of like know that like with constraints, you could get more creative, right? Because you need to find solutions within those constraints to do things better or whatever. But at the same time, it's a question, I guess my question is like, where is the fine line, I guess, where the constraints are just the right constraints, where they allow you to become more creative, and and not too many constraints to the point of being stifling, and knowing that you've now, there's a lot of creative, you're doing a lot of your own creative own work, right? There's Abbott, and then there's Dragon, and there's, I'm sure, new stuff coming along. So how do you, if the constraints aren't there for you, imposed upon you by others, how do you find the perfect balance of like constraints versus non-constraints, I guess, for yourself?
It's interesting because I started out writing poetry 20 years ago. That was the first stuff I published, and where you have, you can impose upon yourself. I'm writing a sonnet or whatnot, but relatively you have freedom, and you also have like 5 people reading it, and so part of it for me is just kind of been a hard-nosed, it's really math, that there's a real trade-off, that basically the bigger of a, if platform, if I'm going to make a Shia Lebanese character that some kid who speaks a language I don't is eventually going to wear a t-shirt with, or something like that, right? That happens via a certain route, right? And if I'm going to tell a story that's completely personal and that I don't care who it reaches, or I don't care how much it sustains me for a year financially, it's a different thing. And I mean, for me, it's always, I think we need to be honest with each other as storytellers. We have to be honest with our readers about this, that this stuff is produced, it's production, just like anything else. And we have to think about who and why it's produced for. And so for me, there's the creative question of, writing monthly comics, for instance. You're going to write something that's 20 to 22 pages that is going to tell a certain amount of story. And, you sort of like, that to me is like writing a sonnet. I don't have a problem with doing that in any way, because it's a formal constraint that, as you're saying, I find liberating. I love working with those kind of formal constraints. And to me, almost anything you work with is going to have that. If I'm working on a movie script, you can't write a 4-hour movie script that anyone will ever see, so you have to think about the certain constraints that are going to determine the shape of that. What becomes a lot thornier, of course, is that the constraints are also political, and that sometimes that formal stuff and the political stuff is tied up, and that to me is the real dance that I find myself having to work my brain much harder to not compromise myself, and to feel like I'm still being politically creative rather than artistically creative in those situations.
Do the political constraints though allow you to speak to not preach to the choir, I guess?
Absolutely. And that's really the main reason, right? When you see, I go to a comic book convention back in the before times, and you see
right.
just hundreds of people who are all like different kinds of people there to talk to you about how they love what you're doing with Spider-Man, or what that's and then you can sneak in a little bit of Spider-Man not being quite so pro cop sometimes, right? And you can sneak in a little bit of I strongly feel like somebody has to be doing that work. I don't, I'm sure I drop the ball sometimes, but I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't feel like it was worth doing, I guess.
One more question for you, actually, because you mentioned that you are only recently kind of having started produce comics, right? But dude, you've been like prolific, like since you've done however many titles. At this point, I'm still like working on my dumb graphic novel, man. I'm just working on the same one.
I was blocked for many years. Basically, I wrote a first novel that got was just a genre talking about genres, very much a genre fantasy novel that was kind of anti-authoritarian and sort of anti-monarchical. I don't know how to I'm saying that word, but in a genre that's very like return the rightful king to his place. And I tried to do some of the kind of work I'm talking about in the fantasy field, and it got got lots of nice attention. And I went to write a second book, and I completely flaked. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Some had to do with kind of a lot of life circumstance stuff, but there were a couple years where I was pretty unproductive, writing a couple short stories here and there, a lot of tweets, and then randomly Marvel came to me and asked if I wanted to write the Black Bolt, and I had this kind of anti-prison Marvel story that fit their thoughts surprisingly well, and it just unlocked. And a lot of that was collaboration. A lot of that was being able to work with an artist, which for me is obviously a very different process than what you do, which is, it's just mind-blowing to me that writer artists that can create that entire world by yourself is like, it's astonishing to me, because I definitely think that my prolific reemergence is definitely just because I work with a lot of awesome artists that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah. So does that mean, because now you're doing a lot of creator own, like your own stuff, and your go-to is like, I'm going to do this as in comics form. So
It is.
Do you feel like is it just the comics bug, or is it you genuinely, have you lost interest in prose? I don't know.
Not categorically, but it's and I may return, especially to the short form, but yeah, when I think about a story now, I first think of it as comics, and being able to collaborate with artists where we both own the stuff together is just it's exciting. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Should we talk to other folks before we have to disappear?
Yeah, I mean, I've just been taking all of this, and Saladin, I didn't miss you attacking poets right there, like 5 people reading poems. Very attacked.
I still write poems,
even though it's true.
It's okay.
Yeah, but like 5 awesome people reading the poem.
Yes,
let me be clear. 5 people read my poems. Only 5 people read my poems. That's
I'm sure only 5 people have read my poems too. But I want to open up the space to people who've been patiently listening. Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can also turn on your video to ask the question. Is there anybody who'd like to go first? You can raise your hand, or like in a classroom, I guess. Or you can just unmute yourself. Anybody?
Hello.
Hi.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi. My name is Joe. I was curious about like just sort of the process of this whole thing. Like clearly, you've been working on this for a pretty long time. You seriously consider the themes of everything you're making and the inspirations that you're taking from. But as for like the actual creation process, like what's it like having to wake up and think, oh, I gotta make this many pages? Like, is there a penciling sort of deadline that you have to set for yourself? Do you break this in chunks? Like, how are you doing it? Because that's the hardest thing for me.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I'm quite late with producing this book is of course I don't abide necessarily by my own deadlines, my own schedule. Like, but definitely the idea is to create a schedule for sure. And the reason I guess I don't abide is on one hand is like I have to like do other work from time to time. But that aside, when I'm not doing other work and I'm just working on the grid, sometimes a page will not take certain pages can't, like, I remember, you know, there was a chapter where to meet the deadline I placed upon myself, I did like maybe 8 pages in a day, you know, and that's like not normal. Like, obviously, like, I don't want anyone coming to me with a price saying like, hey, you could do 8 pages in a day, so just do. But but like, you know, and I was lucky that I guess the style allowed for that, which is basically the style on these bunch of pages, which is like super, you know, lots of ink wash, and the pen lines are kind of very flowy and strokey and fluid, and you know, and it kind of just like allowed for that speed to be done. Contrast that to, say, you know, like, I guess page one, chapter 1 is like the easiest one, because like this one, you know, it took me easy. It's a 3-panel page, but it took me maybe 5-6 days to do just the 1 page, right? So I'm, you know, I think far more professional artists than myself will tell you that, you know, you have your schedule, you do like a page a day, whatever happens, that's going to be, that has to be kind of your rate. And the efficient side of me, and that side exists, sees the logic in that and knows that that's true. The other kind of artistic side, which comes out from time to time and sometimes wants to take over, will be like, well, no, not all pages are created equal. Certain pages need 5 days. You know, that's the reality of the page. That's how you wrote it. You wrote it, and it needs 5 days to be drawn. You know, but the point is, I think, is to realize that. So, like, if you know that this page needs 5 days, then you design the schedule so that you allot the 5 days for that page. And the thing is, as long as you stick to your schedule, it's not that the schedule has to be a page a day. As long as you create a schedule that makes sense to you and you stick to it, you won't get depressed, you know, and you'll be like, okay, you're following schedule. So definitely a schedule is there. I started out writing full script for like, you know, issue 1. But then very quickly I realized that was more time consuming to write a full script for yourself and then draw it. It kind of didn't make sense. I was just kind of like doing what was done in mainstream comics, because I felt like, you know, they know what's best, so I'll just do what they do. They're all professionals, but that makes more sense if you're drawing for another artist, because you need to communicate things, you know, to that artist. If you're drawing for yourself, and you find that, like, actually a lot of artists who draw for themselves don't do full script, and didn't in the past. Like, even the early Marvel days, you know, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, whatever, you know, they would create stories just like as they would just draw. They would create the stories as they're drawing them and draw the stories as they're creating them. They didn't need a script for themselves. And so for me, what I started to do is essentially Marvel method myself. So I would just sort of like write a paragraph or whatever for the issue. You know, do I have that here actually? Yeah, I think I do. So, you know, just standard notebook, and I like find one that I actually. Well, this is the first draft. So yeah, I do more than one draft, you know, but it's like a rough handwritten plot thing. And I have more than one notebook for different. And I can't find that. It's probably like where the work. Anyway, the final draft usually is basically like this kind of plot style, but I'll just, if I have a paragraph, then I'll just like mark with a red pen being like, okay, this is going to be page 1, this is going to be page 2, this is going to be page 3, right? So I sort of like have the paragraph and kind of have it broken down to the number of pages that it will take to draw, and I just go ahead and draw. So I don't know, does that answer your question, or does that to confuse you a bit more?
Bit of column A, bit of column B. Thank you.
We have a question from Dante in the chat, which I think is really prevalent right now. Question for Ganzeer: given how quickly the ecosystem and socio-political system seem to be breaking down, and how long it took you to do the books, did you ever find real life kind of undoing ideas you had for the solar grid?
I don't know if it was undoing or more like just reaffirming, unfortunately, you know. So definitely, like when I came up with the idea of the solar grid, it was just like, I felt like it was so ridiculous that it's just like, it's almost on the verge of fantasy, not science fiction. But then, you know, I saw a couple of proposals from like, one was from like an ex-NASA scientist, and then one was from some astrophysicist, I think in Japan it was, and both of them involve satellites that absorb power of the sun and then kind of beam ultraviolet, or sorry, not ultraviolet, infrared rays down to Earth. And in their proposal is a little different, because it's not, you know, it's not about creating daylight during the nighttime, but it is about attempting to utilize kind of the power of the sun from outer space using satellites to power stations on Earth. So close, you know. So I'm actually seeing more and more similarities, and I think it just makes the narrative more real and more plausible, and more more about the world we live in, which is kind of what I intended anyway.
I think I noticed that the Mars craft in that sequence is like the Bezos dick rocket. A lot.
Okay,
and I was like, oh, this is before that one.
Yeah.
I really agree. It is both fascinating and depressing. It is particularly strange to be publishing the solar grid right when a bunch of billionaires are having a dick measuring contest about who's going to get to the space first. Everybody's just rimming the surface. Nobody's actually made it, but you know. Any other questions? Opening up the space, feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat. If anybody's still thinking, actually, I have a question for the both of you, right? I think Saladin, by virtue of writing for Marvel and you know, with respect to the solar grid, both of your works engage with you know, political issues, engage with sort of, you know, the kind of mess that's happening in the world, and yet both of your work hinges on narratives that hope for or create a hero, right? And it feels, of course, within the Marvel universe, it feels necessary to have a heroic figure. And also in the solar grid, there are, at this point, multiple heroic figures. I'm not going to let you give away who the real hero is, but you know, there are multiple heroic figures, and there's, you know, potential for some of them to rise and be so. And it feels like real world is so much different, right? We don't often have heroes. We don't often have sort of a singular person or a collective bringing down. So how do you gravitate, you know, around that? How do you navigate with around, you know, building heroic figures while striving for sort of real world relevancy in your work?
For me, I suppose, you know, I'm not particularly, I guess relevance is interesting and important to me, but realism per se isn't. And particularly with superheroes, but I think with genre heroes in general, you know, they're filling the sort of cliche is that they're filling the sort of mythic impulse, and you know, we can talk about how useful that theory is, but I think there is, I think people have always sort of told stories to each other about people who had some similarities to the people around them, but could exist in a way that you can't in real life. And to me, it's certainly true that I try and just kind of demographically in terms of representation, and in terms of kind of psychological complexity, childhoods are very important to me. I try and create heroes, genre heroes, whether they're cyborgs or demigods or whatever, vampires, whatever they are, that are human and that feel like they could be people. But I think also there is sometimes an impulse to go too far in that direction and to feel like we're trying to recreate the psychological complexity and all the warts of a real human being on paper, when part of the joy to me of genre storytelling is to be able to like make up a Robin Hood and make up, and if Robin of Lockley was probably a terrible a person, right? But if we dig into any of these figures as actual human beings, we find things we don't want to find. And to me, that's actually part of the weird joy of this, is to imagine what we could be, even though we can't quite be it. And I know that's paradoxical, but I think it does lead to some of us doing some of our best stuff as people.
So I will echo Saladin's statement in some respect, but also contradict it in others, in that, so I acknowledge that and very much believe that like there's no such thing as a good 100% purely good person in existence, not historically, not in present, and not in the future. Like everyone has their yin yang, so to speak, right? And so the what we're used to in what we're used to seeing in our fiction, whether that fiction is in the form of comics or film or novels or whatever, is something I am actively trying to avoid. So definitely like just avoiding this idea of the pure hero and the pure villain who's like so bad and just wants to do bad things, and the hero who's just like there because he wants to save and do good things. Because it's just so to me, I'm just sick of it, to be honest. Like how many more of those stories do we need? And I don't think they do much good. And I think they in fact they may be they may hinder us in being able to see evil in the real world, because we assume that evil only comes in the form of this cartoony kind of very evil person, and that evil person can't easily be a family member or whatever, just doing kind of evil selfish shit. And so with this Solar Grid in particular, with other kind of works of fiction I've dabbled into, I don't think I kind of explored any hero villain kind of characters or aspects in those stories. The stories were usually about other things. But in the Solar Grid, I think I purposefully tried and or have been trying to make each and every character complex in that way, where they're sort of they're not good or bad, they're just kind of both at the same time, except maybe the children, who I think children haven't really had a chance to, I think their characters are still developing as children's characters are, and they're still figuring out what is good and bad and all that stuff, right? In a way, but everyone else is kind of a bit of both, I think.
Thank you so much, Ganzeer. Thank you so much, Saladin, for joining us today. What a wonderful deep diving conversation we've all had the opportunity to witness. Graphic novels are strange and weird and really feel like a portal into something so potent. And all of us are here because we love them, and we aspire to them either as readers or potential creators. And I hope that all of you took away something special from this conversation. I want to remind you that just for today, we have a special offer. If you subscribe to all 10 issues of the Solar Grid, you will receive a Radix Media tote bag, which is fun, and tote bags are fun. But please keep following us. We are Radix Media on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Issues 6 to 10 of the Solar Grid will be out next year. That's 2022. It feels like a long time away, but if the speed by which 2021 passed us by is any indication, then it will be here sooner rather than later. And issue 6 will be out in April 2022. In the meantime, you will have the opportunity to check out the first 5 issues if you haven't already. If there's anybody here who wants to write for Radix Media, feel free to reach out to us. We're also currently accepting submissions of short story collections from writers of color for the Megaphone Prize. You can check it out. And we are publishing one short story collection by the winning manuscript, which we're very excited about. Yes, follow us on social media, follow Ganzeer on social media, follow Saladin on social media. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope you have a wonderful and safe rest of the summer and rest of the year. This is Radix Media signing off. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.